Hello, I'm Ellen Vince. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of these regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something many of us may know only a little about and see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. And as we record, it's April 3rd, 2024.
So from this episode, we are changing our format a little bit based on some feedback we've had, which we love. Please keep sending that in. That's how we learn and grow. To focus much more on a single topic each week, to go into more of a deep dive so we can perhaps empathize more with the situation, understand what's going on, and therefore connect. As you know, up until now, we've had quite a broad brush news review, and we will continue to put out our daily intention suggestions, looking at what's cropping up in the news in our Facebook community group. But here, taking our first not actually our first, but our first this regular new format deep dive on the news, looking at what's been happening with the Tajik people in Russia. And this is in the wake of the attack on the Crocus Concert Hall in Moscow last month. We explore the reasons why Tajiks have been linked with the jihadist group ISIS-K and the prevalence of discrimination against ethnic groups in Russia before the concert hall attack and how that has changed since.
It's a very complex story, isn't it? There's so many different factors to it, and I learned so much in investigating this.
Really interesting to see what's been happening since it's been in the headlines, particularly in the Western media as well, what's actually really going on the ground with the Tajik people. So a story that we were all talking about a week or two back, but has had some very profound repercussions for a whole group of people, indeed, well over several million people in Russia.
And President Putin, I believe, is still trying to blame the Ukrainians for doing this. Is that, as of a few days ago, that's what he was still holding on to?
Yeah, they're still trying to make a link there, although having accepted, I think, as well, that ISIS-K, this jihadist group, probably had a role to play.
Well, and as we'll talk about in a few minutes, something that impressed me so much about this story is understanding, how does ISIS even get a hold on people? How did they do that? And it's people who are frustrated and don't have any other way to express their frustrations about their government are fertile ground for these terrorist and extremist groups.
Exactly. It's almost they feel they have nothing else to lose.
Right.
So, as you might recall, last week, 11 people were arrested. We reported on this last week on suspicion of committing or being complicit in the murder of at least 139 concertgoers at Moscow's Crocus City Hall on the 22nd March. 7 of those arrested are citizens of the small Central Asian nation of Tajikistan, a branch of the militant group Islamic State known as ISIS-K, has claimed responsibility for the attack. And while not naming ISIS-K specifically, Russian President Vladimir Putin, as we just mentioned, has said that radical Islamists were responsible for the assault, who he said had been trying to escape to Ukraine. Russians seem to believe that the attacker's nationality is related to the attack, with a number of threats, verbal abuse, and increased harassment from law enforcement and civilians alike on Tajik nationals living in Russia rising dramatically in recent days. Other ethnic minorities have faced similar displays of prejudice. Their trade is being refused. For example, Tajik taxi drivers are not being hired. And both physical and verbal abuse is being faced by the more than 3 million Tajiks who live in Russia, many of whom are completely innocent of the attacks and have no association with radical Islam. In the wake of the attack, Police raids, evictions from homes, and threats of revenge on social media have left many ethnic minorities who live in Russia literally fearing for their lives. And some other Central Asian states, such as Tajikistan, have warned their citizens against traveling to Russia. At the same time, some Russian politicians have also called for curbs on immigration.
So, who are these Tajiks and why do they come to Russia? Tajikistan is a small landlocked country, about 70% the size of Minnesota in the US, and with a population of around 10 million people sandwiched between Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and China. I thought it was interesting that it bordered on China. It is rated as being the most impoverished of the former Soviet republics, although the World Bank reports that strong economic growth and higher wages helped reduce poverty from 30% of the population in 2009 to an estimated 12.4% in 2022, with around 80% of its revenue coming from income from Tajikistani migrant laborers working in Russia and Kazakhstan. A strictly regressive regime in which political opposition parties are banned. It has been ruled by former Soviet cotton baron President Emomali Rahman since 1994, who was declared founder of peace and national unity, leader of the nation in 2015. Tajikistan became independent in 1991 following the breakup of the Soviet Union, but quickly faced a civil war between political, regional, and religious factions that lasted from 1992 to 1997, and in which up to 100,000 people are believed to have been killed. Sunni Muslims constitute around 85% of the total population. The country remains dependent on Russia, both to bolster its economy and provide security. Rahman has reportedly spoken to Putin in the wake of the Crocus Concert Hall attack and disowned the Tajiks allegedly responsible. At the same time, the country is expanding its ties with China as Chinese firms are investing in oil and gas exploration. Rahman maintains cordial relations with Moscow. The attraction of many Tajiks to working in Russia has a mutual advantage for both countries. Russia is dependent on low-income migrants as its own population has been falling, while Tajiks struggle to find employment at home. Tajiks do not need visas to enter Russia, removing a major barrier for seeking work in other countries. They've been coming to Russia now for decades to earn some money to support their families due to the lack of work and decent wages back home. One journalist from the region, Bektor Iskender, explained, escaping the pull of migration to Russia is no simple feat. For most young people in my country, as in Tajikistan, lucrative job opportunities are scarce. Finding work abroad is the sole avenue for supporting their families. Russia, despite its problems, is the best option many of them have. So you see where Russia needs these people because, their population is low. They need migrant workers. And that's the only place where these Tajikistans can go and work.
Exactly. To get a visa to work in Europe, for example, is virtually impossible for people from that area. It's very interesting. I was reading about the geopolitics of this whole region, this Central Asian region, the quite a few former Soviet states, where there's an awful lot of corruption and infrastructure problems. It's actually very important to Russia, these countries. They have a very strong influence in that area. And what I was reading about was what happens if Russia comes out of its war with Ukraine a weaker power. Will it increase its influence in that area or will it diminish? And that's a bit of an unknown because the suggestion is it will have a much weaker influence in Europe and the Black Sea, and Turkey especially will have quite a strong influence in that area. We should look at Turkey at some point. It's such a fascinating country in the midst of all this. But also, of course, as we mentioned just there, China is extending its influence, its investment.
Yes.
As well.
That could be scary too.
So the geopolitics are fascinating.
Yes.
If Russia comes out of this a weakened power, so is no longer such a strong ally, perhaps, or seen as a necessary strong ally to China, could China really be extending its power in this area?
Yes.
And indeed, that could have quite dire consequences for the Russian economy, ultimately. But that's all conjecture, really, of course. But I think it's fascinating how geopolitics can change things quite quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why were Tajik nationals specifically linked to ISIS? Well, Tajik passports were found on the gunmen who were arrested by Russian authorities, suggesting a possible link to Islamic State Khorasan, as it's called, ISIS-K, which is an Afghanistan-based offshoot of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which, according to a June 2023 UN report, is the most serious current terrorist threat in Afghanistan, neighboring countries, and Central Asia. US intelligence also points responsibility for the Crocus Hall attack to ISIS-K. This group was formed in 2014. It's led by a 29-year-old Sanaullah Ghaffari, who is said to advocate high-profile attacks. And it has aggressively recruited from Tajikistan, according to security experts. Taliban sources say that Ghaffari is himself an Afghan Tajik. ISIS-K claimed responsibility for the 3 blasts earlier this year that killed at least 95 people attending the commemoration of the death of Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force, who had been killed, I believe, in a US drone strike back in 2020. At the time of that attack, the Iranian government traced the suicide bombings to ethnic Tajik fighters belonging to ISIS-K. The group also claimed responsibility for the 2021 suicide bombing on Kabul International Airport. This was the time of the US and allied military withdrawal from Afghanistan. And in that particular raid, 13 US military and civilians were killed. It also claimed responsibility for a deadly attack in September 2022 on the Russian embassy in Kabul. There have been other attacks by Tajiks in Afghanistan, and there have also been failed attempts in both Germany and Turkey. A June 2023 report to the UN Security Council estimated that the group's fighters and their families number between 4,000 to 6,000, including many citizens of this region in Central Asia. The group has been bolstered by foreign fighters who fled Iraq to Afghanistan. This was at the fall of the power base of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, bringing expertise in guerrilla warfare. Although a Taliban intelligence official estimated that 90% of ISIS-K's makeup is now non-Pashtun, that's the ethnic Afghan group, with Tajiks being especially targeted as recruits. ISIS-K is a major rival to the Taliban in Afghanistan, which was new to me. I didn't know that.
I did not know that either.
No, that was really quite interesting. In recent years, the group has repeatedly sought to strike at Russia in retaliation for its support of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad against Islamic State in the civil war in Syria, which helped to defeat ISIS's regional operations there. So that's why Russia has come very much under their radar. ISIS-K has been plotting attacks within Russia for some time, said Eron Zelin, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Meanwhile, Russia's FSB security service said that an armed attack by the group on a synagogue near Moscow earlier last month had been intercepted. The group's networks within the Tajik and Central Asian communities are thought to have aided efforts to conduct operations in Moscow with the large expat population of Tajiks there, according to Zelin. And the think tank Carnegie Endowment says that radicalization of some Muslims in Central Asia has been going on for years, particularly in Tajikistan. It notes that in a country where political opposition is not allowed and conditions for many are poor, radicalization offers a clear path for those who are opposed to the regime. Media groups affiliated with ISIS-K produce religious tracts and other political content and social media posts in the Tajik language, criticizing President Rahmon for being too close to Russia and for not championing the cause of what they see as true Islam. And following the Crocus City concert hall attack, Carnegie Endowment say it's easy for Moscow to target Central Asian migrants who are already facing extreme discrimination.
That's very unfortunate because they probably feel like now they have some fodder for this discrimination.
Exactly. And clearly Rahmon, their own country is not going to support them. So they're very much at the mercy of the goodwill of Russia, essentially.
Yeah. So what's going on in Russia? And why is there such extreme xenophobia, especially toward the Tajiks, as we just talked about? Xenophobia has long been a major threat to Central Asian communities in Russia, with many ethnic nationals facing police checks, unlawful detentions, discrimination in places of work, and more. In the spring of 2023, for example, reports emerged of Tajik hunts in various regions of Russia, including mass arrests and searches of migrants for no apparent reason, and together with numerous acts of violence, too. Edward Lemon, an expert in Central Asia and research professor at Texas A&M, told Deutsche Welle that some Russians perceive Central Asians as uneducated, potential criminals, and terrorists. However, it's hard to get a handle on the precise extent of prejudice, but some commentators have likened it to the kind of xenophobia faced by many Latin American migrants in the U.S. And there seems no evidence that xenophobia is any worse in Russia than elsewhere. Back in 2008, a survey put around 50% of Russian citizens as holding prejudiced views toward foreigners and some ethnic groups, collectively referred to as migrants. It's not clear how or whether this figure has changed in the years since. However, xenophobia has become the norm among patriots, war bloggers, and others who have come to the fore since Russia invaded Ukraine. The Russian security establishment has pushed for a tightening of immigration legislation in the last 2 years, a move that surveys have suggested be supported by many Russians. Officials like Alexander Bastrikin, head of the Investigate Committee, the Russian equivalent of the FBI, have helped fuel anti-migrant sentiment by linking the rising incidence of murder and rape cases to foreign nationals. The majority of incomers do not integrate into Russian society, he said. They do not study the Russian language and culture. They try to isolate themselves and keep to their own traditions, and he is quoted as saying this previously. Officially, the Russian government does not directly promote radical nationalism or xenophobia, although President Putin has stated that we must secure the interests of national business and of the indigenous population of Russia, unquote, which some have interpreted as a coded warning against migrants. Yet, Tajik nationals are among those who are providing the manpower needed to sustain Russia's war against the Ukraine. The 2024 report of Human Rights Watch says that since autumn of 2022, Russian authorities have been actively recruiting Central Asian migrants to sign military contracts, threatening them with deportation if they do not comply. PBS reports that Russia's ethnic minorities disproportionately number those killed in the war.
And I think I read as well that those who are coming from Central Asia, Tajikistan, and elsewhere, whilst they don't need a visa, before they are actually admitted and allowed to work in Russia,
Right,
they're having to sign similar commitments to military service. So essentially, they are signing up and going to Russia.
Well, this is a familiar story around the world in many different countries. And it's
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the story, I mean, the xenophobia there, if not official, some of the words from at least some of the politicians, some of the attitudes amongst seemingly quite a lot of the population, sadly, I think we're probably familiar with in our own
Yes.
countries.
Yes.
So what is the situation now? Attacks against Tajiks have radically increased in the wake of the Crocus Concert Hall attack. Social media hate speech has intensified. Shops run by Tajik nationals have been set on fire, and Tajik nationals have been assaulted. Courts in St. Petersburg last week ruled to deport 418 foreign citizens, while the Russian independent media outlet Mediazona reported that rights groups had received more than 2,500 complaints from Central Asian migrants about unwarranted police checks and unlawful detentions in the 2 days following the concert hall attack, saying that dozens of them have reportedly been subjected to torture.
Mm.
Timur Umarov, a Central Asian expert at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin, doubts that Moscow can afford to cut off its migrant flows, given its reliance on Central Asian labor.
It's ironic that they need them, and yet they're taking this stance.
Exactly.
It's counterintuitive.
It is. And again, I think it's just exploiting a people that has no voice and has no protection from their own nation. They are dependent on Russia for work. Yeah, it's a horrific situation. And any suspicion of potential link or having any intelligence, I imagine, around ISIS-K links is being extracted through torture, potentially.
Right. And it seems that this act by the ISIS-K has made things worse for the rest of the people in the country. So it didn't accomplish what they hoped it would.
No, exactly.
No.
And I think one of the news reports I saw, I think it was the Deutsche Welle story, where they were interviewing a number of Tajiks living in Russia. Certainly quite a common view expressed was these people who have been radicalized are strongly in the minority.
Yes.
They do not represent most of us. They're not representative of what our people are about, our country's about, why we have
Islam
come to
is
Russia.
about. Yeah,
what Islam is about. Exactly.
Right.
So this is one of these terrible situations where an entire ethnic group essentially is being subjected to discrimination and worse on the back of the actions of 2 or 3 people. Or
yes.
a small group of people, as far as we can tell. If indeed they are responsible, that's obviously yet to be proven.
Yes. Oh, so where might we focus our intentions in this story?
So, as discrimination against Tajik nationals following the Crocus City Hall has the potential to exacerbate and kindle new waves of violence, we suggest this week holding for our intention, we will that Russian citizens see that the majority of migrant workers in their country are peaceful, loving, and trying to provide for their families. Please join us in holding this.
May it be so, and may it be so all around the world. We should hold this intention in many countries.
We should, yes. Yeah, definitely. Oh my goodness. Well, so yes, here's, as we said earlier, here's a story that kind of has disappeared largely from the news, but as we start to peel behind it, we see there's a huge need for our prayers, our intention, our focus, our continued support, especially for something that has an enormous potential to, I guess, go off the radar.
Yes.
Millions of people living in fear and kind of without support. So,
well, I think what the media is covering, and justifiably, is finding these people who committed the crime and how they're being persecuted, and not about the rest of the people who are being affected, as we've talked about, in the country. So we're not hearing about that other piece. And I'm glad that we were able to dive into that today.
Absolutely. And clearly ISIS-K does present a threat to Western nations as well. There have been, I believe, intelligence suggesting potential attacks in the US and elsewhere, which presumably have been intercepted to date. Well, they have been. There haven't been, to my knowledge, examples in the US, but this is a powerful group. So Islamic State has sort of been born again in Afghanistan. It may have been extinguished as a major force in Syria, Iraq, but as we said earlier, a lot of those fighters have moved, and there's been a big recruitment in that region.
Well, that's something else that I personally will hold this week is the people of Tajikistan, and thinking of the desperation that they're feeling and the frustration and not being able to express their displeasure with their government in any way, but feeling as though they have to resort to this, and they don't. No one ever has to resort to terrorism. So I'll be thinking about that too.
Yes.
So that about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in Clive's daily Insight Timer offerings, and with me in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out too for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us and holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime,
thank you. Go well. Stay safe.
And remember, we are more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Bintz and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.